So now for introductions. Starting right here, our first, the first person closest to me, sitting closest to me, is Dawn Anahid Makin. She is the author of The 100-Year Walk, an Armenian Odyssey, available back there, which chronicles her grandfather's survival of genocide. The book, a finalist for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, received the American Society of Journalists and Authors Best Biography Award. Previously, she was a staff writer at Salon, Newsdays, and Smart Money. It's probably Salon, but I like the French. Her work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Elle, the Los Angeles Times, the Sunday Times Magazine, and elsewhere. Skipping Nasreen for now. Furthest for me is Aline Ohanessian, whose debut novel, Orhan's Inheritance, was a finalist for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, the Penn Bellwether Award for Socially Engaged Fiction, the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize, and was shortlisted for the Dublin International Literary Prize. And I think you called it a Forever Bridesmaid or something of that sort. But it is also the winner of the 2015 Tololian Prize for Contemporary Fiction, a Barnes & Noble Discovery pick, and the #1 indie pick for April 2015. The novel is an international bestseller and has been translated into over 10 languages. Last but not least, our facilitator, moderator, and a colleague of mine, Dr. Nasreen Rahimieh, is the Howard Baskerville Professor of Humanities and Chair of the Comparative Literature Department at UCI. She is the author of Iranian Culture, Representation and Identity, and Farrokhzad, Iconic Woman and Feminine Pioneer of New Persian Poetry, co-edited with Dominic Parviz Bukhshah. She has also written an article, actually, on an Iranian-Armenian female novelist. Just in case you guys are interested in that. So I'm going to now hand things off to Dr. Rahimieh, and please give them a warm welcome, and we'll start the program.
Thank you, Huri. I'm just delighted to be here. I feel like an interloper, but in a way, I feel, as I was explaining to Dawn and Aline both, I have my own very deep Armenian connection. The first school I went to in Iran on the Caspian Sea, it was an Armenian school. And one of my friends from back that time is here, Satanik. And it's wonderful to be with a community with whom I've always felt a sense of belonging. So, and delighted to be here to tell you how wonderful both works are, and we will talk about it in more detail. But before we go any further, both of our authors have generously offered to read a little bit from their works to set the tone, and then I will lead the discussion with some questions. Aline, would you like to start?
This is from the middle of the book. The chapter is called Rebirth. The dry dirt of the desert covers the open sores on her feet. Huddled in one corner of the abandoned shed, Lucine shuts her eyes and tries to pray, but the words so carefully etched into her mind by Maidig and their priest have escaped her. Fragments and short phrases from ancient prayers rise above the fog, empty and impotent, the crazed ramblings of a misguided race. She pushes the words aside and presses baby Aram's blue swaddling cloth to her chest instead. The smell of Maidig's milk is long gone, but inside its folds she can still smell the sweetness of him. She burrows her face in the tattered blue wool, sniffing at the lingering scent of his sweat and licking its center where she still tastes the salt of his tears, or hers, she isn't sure. Soon, his screams, long melodic wails followed by a staccato of angry reprieves, fill the empty shed, and she is glad. She will do nothing to stop them this time. A dusty beam of daylight filters through the small crack in the back wall through which her keeper, the plump woman, regularly wedges small pieces of cured lamb and bread. Lucine tries to relieve herself as far away from this opening as she can, but the chamber pot sits festering in the opposite corner. The excrement, like so much suffering, is ongoing and unpredictable. It leaves her as Mairig and Anush and Bedros left her, permanently and without warning. In her arms, a silent witness to all this exorcism, Aram's ghost gives up his screaming and sucks impatiently at her breast, the only part of her incapable of excretion. At nightfall, the plump one arrives, carrying her stale bread. She talks about how the gendarmes like to lick her back and pull her hair as they thrust themselves into her. "How are you doing?" she asks Lucine. But Lucine gives her no answers. She hasn't spoken since the river. "How is the child?" The woman tries again. Lucine continues rocking the phantom Aram. "What does he eat?" the woman asks. Lucine lays a hand on her concave chest. The woman sings in Turkish, "Dandini, dandini, danali bebek, eleri kolara, kınali bebek." It is a lullaby to an infant resting in a secret hiding place. When the infant dies, its mother goes mad and buries it in a golden cradle, then offers herself to the waves. A fitting ditty, only this wasn't the exact order of things. Some days later, when the plump one is once again delivering her bread, Aram is gone. His screams recede from her ears to the back of her head like church bells in a dream. The swaddling cloth lies weightless on her lap. Lucine is searching its folds for any evidence of him, a hair, a stain, but all that remains is the smell. Still, she searches for his spirit in the now coarse fabric of the swaddling cloth. The plump one finally pries the blue wool out of Lucine's hands. "You can come out now," she says. "You'll live with me. I've arranged it." Lucine cries out at the words, "You'll live." A hot liquid anger courses through her veins. She strikes the woman over and over again in the face, shoulders, and chest. The woman wraps her plump arms around Lucine's body and squeezes. "We are not what is done to us," she whispers in Lucine's ear. She pulls something silver and smooth from a pocket of her dress. Lucine stares at the blade with relief, thinking the woman will now end all her suffering. She tilts her head back, offering her exposed neck to the stranger. "My name is Fatma, and Allah has placed you in my protection," she says. "Gold doesn't lose its value by falling into the mud." I'll stop there.
Thank you. Now, Dawn, may I ask you?
Absolutely, that was beautiful. Aline. Oh, can you? Okay, closer. Okay. Can you hear me? No. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. So this is from partway into the book, and it's the book alternates between my grandfather's account, which takes place before and during the genocide, and my account, almost a century later, of retracing his steps. And my grandfather's name was Stepan Mishyan, and he was separated. He was in the labor battalion and separated from his family, and he was on a train. And so this is kind of where, and his family was in a camp off outside one of the train stations. Around midnight on that dreary night, a cattle car pulled out of the darkness and into Chai station. On the platform, Stepan's brother Armenian tried to catch his breath. With his sisters trailing him, he had sprinted there from his tent, pitched in the nearby field where the Mishyan family had been living. He did this whenever he heard the siren's call, always hoping it carried his soldier brother Stepan. Peering inside the compartments, Armenian could tell it held a labor company, a good sign. But he couldn't find his little brother. Had he received false information? Stepan should have been calling him by now, shining a light, something. Yet the cars remained still like a ghost train. In one car, Armenian approached a work serviceman. No, Stepan wasn't there. Precious time elapsed. He asked another, who directed him to a different car. Still no luck. Armenian had one last car to check. He found someone from back home who knew Stepan. Nudged awake, Stepan learned his brother was outside. Loyal Armenian, whom he hadn't seen in more than half a year. Already, Stepan had dozed away precious time, and now he had less than 2 minutes remaining before the train left. With the guards sleeping nearby, he grabbed onto the high iron window and pulled himself up. Glancing out, he could see his brother, his face inches from his. How he'd longed for this reunion, and it was almost gone. Armenian pushed a small pouch through the bars. It had money, Stepan could see. He couldn't accept it, and he shoved it back into his older brother's hands. The locomotive hissed. It was about to depart. One final time, Armenian forced the pouch back, besting him like a game of hot potato. You need it more than I do, Armenian insisted. The brothers began to weep. Goodbye, Stepan said. Kiss everyone for me. The eastbound train rocked away, widening the distance between the two. Armenian grew smaller by the second, like a lost kite, until he disappeared completely into the expanse of night. Stepan laid awake, reflecting on the sadness of it all. Was that our last conversation, he wondered? The moment weighed as heavy as his fatigue, to which he eventually succumbed. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. So let me begin by asking, and because this is what I teach in literature, so the question of the form, the genre in which you have written. And as you describe it, it's a reconstruction of history and a really meticulous, painful reconstruction. And you also go back into the past, but you write in the form of the novel. So I'm interested in hearing how you negotiated the choice of the genre, or did the genre come after? Did you know at what point what voice you would be using? So either one of you can start.
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah.
Actually, I was a graduate student here at UC Irvine in the history department when I started writing this book. I was ABD, and I was supposed to be writing my dissertation about U.S. history. And I was sort of cheating on my dissertation with this monster of a book, and I didn't know exactly what I was doing. I was afraid to call it anything. So I didn't set out to say, I'm going to be writing an Armenian genocide novel. It'll be historical fiction. It'll be literary. I went in blind, and so it happened very organically. The material dictated what genre it would be. And being of Armenian descent and growing up in a very vibrant Armenian community in Los Angeles, I had read a great deal about this period in history. I had family stories that I was familiar with. I had studied Armenian history. So that all was there as I began exploring these characters, but the further I got along with the narrative, the more research I had to do. So instead of researching my dissertation, I was reading diaries from the period, all kinds of secondary and primary sources. So yeah, I was a history grad student when I started writing this. And yeah, the genre was dictated by the characters and the material itself. It was great not to have to footnote anything.
So the genre, well, maybe the decision came out of history, and I'm pun history department.
Definitely, yeah.
Thank you. Dawn.
Hi. So for me, it was a little bit of a different situation. I grew up hearing about my grandfather's story. I'm half Armenian. I can't speak Armenian except for a few words, and I mispronounce them. So, and I grew up hearing the story of my grandfather, but I really didn't understand that much more besides these little snippets of his survival of the genocide, and that he had written it all down. And professionally, I became a reporter, and I was an investigative reporter in New York, working for newspapers and magazines. So my genre was always nonfiction, and I always found, just true life to be so bizarre and crazy that I always loved to tell these stories. And I don't have the imagination that Aline, or probably many of you have here. But it really gnawed, my grandfather's story gnawed on me, like, for years, and my mother always wanted me to tell her father's story. And so finally, it really took, but I could never read it because it was in Armenian. And when a relative finally translated it into English, I couldn't believe that I couldn't believe his story. And since he died when I was a child, I was really learning about him. He was telling me his story directly, and I just felt this incredible weight that I was spending my life telling other people's stories and trying to make a difference and trying to highlight bad policies, and I just had to tell his story. And so it really came down to, and his story was important historically also because there weren't that many adult males who survived the massacres in the Deir ez-Zor area. And my grandfather had left hundreds of pages of what had happened to him. And, but his story was still dictated by what he left, what kind of research, what did he write about. And as a reporter, I brought my kind of research skills to try to fill out those holes. And so that's why I didn't just, he wrote it also for his peers at the time, in the 60s when there were a lot of, he wrote it for many decades, but he wrote it kind of for a lot of other Armenians who had gone through the genocide, and he would say things like, oh, we all know that this happened, and these different parts, and surely his peers did, but a century later, when you're reading this, there were a lot of holes that needed to be filled. How many people were in the camp, what were their experiences, and so I spent years trying to track down. My grandfather was really detailed, and he would leave the names, first names, last names, what towns they were from, of the people in his caravans. And so I tried to find out what happened to those people, and spent years just researching, and found a number of their stories and accounts or family members, which really helped fill in some of those gaps and really dictated a lot of the narrative and different scenes that I tell in the story. So.
I've done a lot of events with Dawn. We met a few years ago when our books were coming out, and every time she talks about why she wrote the book, I get goosebumps. Mm-hmm. It never gets old for me, and I don't think anyone has done. There are nonfiction books about the genocide, written first-person accounts, but I don't know of many books that are like Dawn's book. The amount of investigative research that went into it is just remarkable. The people that you found 100 years later, it's just a testament to what a good reporter you are and a good storyteller you are.
Oh, thank you. But I was also drawing on such incredible research that so many other historians have done, and all the predecessors, like Andonian, out of Paris, and all those accounts, or even Virginia Savazlian in Yerevan, all those folklore. Those interviews she did collecting the songs people would sing in the caravans. And so really, this is, I think, I think I can speak for us, we're, several generations removed from the genocide, but we're here today because it's still affecting so many of our families and has affected. And so, kind of to draw from all the people who have worked to raise awareness for this or told their stories, and now to tell it through our generation and our perspective, I think just helps to expand the the story.
For those of you who haven't read either one of these narratives, what is also compelling about, in addition to the way in which you did the research, is the fact that you actually physically also retraced those steps. That was really impressive to me, and I must say I was blown away, and I couldn't put the book down. Both books I read almost in one setting because they were both so compelling for different reasons, but in Orhan's inheritance, because it's a fictional story, it has a way that it draws you in. And in your case, Dawn, you know, I was struck by how you place yourself in your grandfather's steps. And maybe just I can, for the sake of those who haven't read the books, could you tell us about one of those wonderful discoveries, people that you found, and in a way you made peace with a family that had helped? Do you want to say a little bit about that? And then I want to come back to you.
Sure, absolutely. So when I started out doing research for this book, it was just my grandfather's story, and you know, it was always, and it still is. Most of the book is still his story, and it's probably about 1/3 of it is mine. But as I retraced his steps, and you know, as a reporter, I really felt like I had to see the land where, you know, my grandfather and so many others marched, and to understand the distance and the geography, because the desert became, you know, like a prison for so many of them, and certainly a cemetery. And I just had to see the land and understand it. And so I retraced my grandfather's nearly 1,000-mile journey from outside his, you know, from his hometown outside present-day Istanbul, across Turkey and across to eastern Syria, and where my grandfather escaped from a massacre. But when I was doing this, you know, I tried to go. My grandfather was, you know, went to a Turkish bathhouse, you know, at one point, and was kicked out when they found out he was Armenian. He had left a camp for momentarily. So I went to a bathhouse in that town, and actually when I told the women there that I was Armenian, you know, they embraced me. And so I had these kind of beautiful moments that I thought were really important to show just 100 years later, and certainly the places where we can heal. And then as I followed my grandfather's footsteps, there was a Muslim Arab sheikh who took in my grandfather when he escaped from the Deir ez-Zor massacres and treated him like a son. And I found that family when I was retracing my grandfather's steps, and I was able to thank them for taking in my family. And that was incredibly healing, because, I mean, because within all this darkness there was certainly light, and that's what helped my grandfather survive. And also through research, you know, there was a man who survived the same massacre as my grandfather, which was in the Markada region, just north of Deir ez-Zor, on the Harbor River. And I knew this man survived my grandfather, survived the massacres. My grandfather saw him after, you know, toward the end of the war. So I spent years searching for this man to see if he ever wrote anything down about his experience. And it took me years with a lot of false starts of, you know, running into like a nursing home and hearing this woman's his daughter and finding out she's not. And, you know, but I finally found his account published in Romania in an Armenian newspaper in the 20s and in 1940. And so it helped me understand that last night when my grandfather, you know, thousands of people were killed and my grandfather escaped before they did, and this man Haratun Atanasyan also escaped after my grandfather. So he explained what it was like, you know, just the silence and the flatness of the desert. And he also helped me pinpoint exactly where it was. So, and of his experience of having to leave his wife, and of leaving his wife and trying to, you know, for his escape. And so it just, all these, the research really dictated what I could tell. And so I was able to expand this really important night historically, you know, when so many thousands of people were killed, and my grandfather and his friend escaped. And so I was very happy to expand my grandfather's account and also, show another eyewitness to this, to this horrible event.
Thank you. Now, Aline, there's a beautiful love story, a connection here, and I have been dying to ask you, what is the source of those characters? Are they real? I mean, look at me. I'm a literary critic who wants to know, was this a real Orhan? Was it, or what were the characters based on? Because you talked about how you felt a compelling urge to write, but you didn't know what was going to be. So I'm interested about the characters.
They're all made up. I don't come from Sivas. My grandparents did not come from that region. I purposefully, we're actually from Adana, which is all, as far away as you can get from where this book takes place. I did that on purpose. I wanted a little bit of psychological distance between myself and my characters so that I can have some freedom. And I'm not as brave as Dawn is to stick my finger in my own family wounds and family history. The first iteration of the book, when I found out that I was writing an Armenian genocide book, I called my best friend who's an Armenian filmmaker, and she said, not this subject, write about anything else. We don't need another regurgitation of this story. And she's my first reader. She's somebody I really respect. But I still felt like I had to tell this story first. And I had read all the other fictional accounts. I'm talking about Micheline Aharon and Mark Holmes' excellent book, Three Apples Fell from Heaven. I'm talking about Nancy Krikorian's book, Zabel. I had read all of them, and I read The Gendarme, which is, I hadn't read Sandcastle Girls yet, but I felt like there was still a story that needed to be told in a unique way, in a way that was different from how it had been told up until this point. And so I wrote the whole thing. It took me several years, and then I got on a plane and went to see the land and to see the little town where this book takes place. It's more of a village. They were still burning cow dung for fuel. They were still getting water from a well. And I spent a little time there, not too long, just about 10 days. And that's when Orhan came into the picture. Because when I was in Turkey, the people who helped me were all Turks. There was a Turkish poet, a Turkish historian, an academic, who didn't know me from Adam. I met them on the internet, which is always a good idea to go to a foreign country and meet a total stranger from the internet and put your life in her hands. But that's what I did. I got off the plane in Sivas, and she was there. She was there, and she translated for me, and she aided me in a way that no one has had until that point. And I thought that there was another story to this, and that was the story of the Turkish side of the story. And I wanted to write both of those into the book, and I hadn't seen that done to my satisfaction yet. So the book got new legs, and then I devoted another 5 or 6 years because Orhan was his own person and demanded a lot of attention.
It's beautifully done. That's all I can say. It's such a subtle story in terms of, when I think of the love stories and the connections, misconnections, this is very beautifully done. I was also struck, after I read both of your books, struck by the fact that both narratives are preceded by maps. And, there are different kinds of reasons why authors will pinpoint a map. In your case, well, you're documenting, you're going back to history, retracing steps. But these maps, how do they figure in your own imagination, in your own creation. You've talked about it a little bit in terms of, but taking you the displacement that's happening geographically. And there's also a different kind of displacement, which is historical. One you can pinpoint on a map, and the other one is a little bit more diffuse. So any thoughts you have on those?
Well, I had a map in my writing room, the famous map that many Armenians have in their home. I did not have it in my home. You guys know what I'm talking about. It's the map of the deportation routes and the killing fields and all that. I went and bought that map because I didn't own it, because it's sort of a sad thing to put up on a wall, in my opinion. But when I was writing this book, I put that map and I let it remind me and guide me. And this is a book about displacement, temporal displacement, geographic displacement. Even my Turkish character is an exile who gets exiled from Turkey in the late 80s. So the map was important, but I don't know how conscious I was at the time, because when you're writing, I'm sure maybe nonfiction is the same way. When you're writing, it's like, everything is dark. You only know, you're discovering as you write, discovering your characters, discovering the narrative, because it doesn't exist, right? It's fictional. So you're creating as you go along. So the map was just sort of like a guiding light for me.
Thank you. Dawn?
Yes. For me, when I started to work with my grandfather's account, the first thing I did was to go through it and to write down every place that he had gone, every town, and the time period that he was, what year, what month, and then I built my research, and I tried to find out, okay, what happened in Katma, December 1916, which is now in, present-day Syria, but used to be part of the Ottoman Empire. And so that, it was this map that I was kind of creating, because I really wanted to understand what happened in all these places, what are the holes my grandfather left in his account of his time during that period, and just focused my research and expanded everything I could find about those places. And then of course, when I came to the time when I was retracing my grandfather's steps, I had this map and to follow, but a funny thing about when you put a map in a book, which I never understood before, I thought that publishers, you have a major publisher, you would hire a cartographer to create these maps. And it ended up being me and my editor, and I felt like Shazam! There's mountains there, And it was really tricky. And so I've learned these are just basically approximations of locations and distances. But I felt it was important for the reader, especially those people who aren't familiar with the area, and certainly those who aren't familiar with our history, because I always wanted my grandfather's story to be read, of course, with within the Armenian community, but also for other people who don't know, they've never met an Armenian before, they don't know anything about the genocide, and they're reading and they're just starting to care about this man Stepan, who lived 100 years ago, and as he goes through everything and struggles to survive, they learn about the genocide and start to care about what happened. And so the map is there for all of us, and don't judge the distances between the towns.
But there's a way in which the maps, and then either actual photographs in the case of your book, or photography as such, the use of images and the design in the case of the character, why he photographed and when he stopped taking pictures. And so there's a way in which there's a visual and verbal dance together that is happening. So if you could take a minute and tell me, or what you feel was really interesting and important to you in terms of photography? Now, in your case, as a theme in the novel, but for you in other ways.
Well, I wanted Orhan to be an artist because I have an affinity for creative people, and I thought I could understand him better if he was a creative person. And then I thought it would be interesting to see, it's hard to be a creative person in Turkey. It's also hard to be a historian in Turkey. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, and now especially, I think we all know what's happening under the current regime. So I wanted for him to have scars. I wanted for him to question his identity at a young age. And so turning him into a photographer who is then persecuted as a result of photographs that the state interpreted as political in nature. He was exiled to Germany. All of that was very important to his character development. And again, the visual imagery in the book and of his photographs are an insight to the character, but also to the nation that he's a part of and the family that he's part of, because his identity is multi-layered, his individual history, his family history, and then his national history. I wanted to hit all of those layers of who he was. And I thought if I made him into an artist, I could understand his psyche a little bit better.
Great. So I do have some photographs as an insert in the book, but photographs really helped me understand, better understand the time period, and just even small details, which probably many of us have seen. The signs during the autumn outside storefronts, of all the different languages, Armenian or French, Ottoman, Turkish, Greek, and all of those really helped me better understand the era. And I also, in terms also of maps, I also found a map of Adabazar where my family's from, in an old 1939 book, just kind of hand drawn, with, and so all of these things kind of helped me better understand the places that I was writing about. And for photographs, I just found every photograph that I could, every single one that I could about my family's town, because that's where my grandfather was from. So it was really, what happened to him and what happened to the town when the deportation happened, and just through every compatriot books from the time period, postcards from the Ottoman Empire about the town. I also, pictures of my grandfather and his family, so I could describe what his brother Armenian looked like, And also, after a lot of research, I found my grandfather worked in this flour mill in Tarsus toward the end of the war. The Shalvarjian brothers, they took in Armenians. They were Armenian and helped a number of Armenians during that time period. But I wanted to know, what did this flour mill look like? And they were, creating flour for, the war. And so I finally found the son of the Shalvarjian family in Canada, and they had a picture of this mill. And so it's just, a few sentences in the book, but it helped me, it sat on a river, and, just what it looked like. So I could better explain and depict what it was like. My grandfather was saying what it was like when he worked there, but what did it look like? And so that's how I used photographs in my book as well.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a privilege. I'm delighted to have met you both, and just can't wait for the next books to come out. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your questions.
Thank you, Nasrin. Thank you so much.